Vanishing River Cave Tragedy. On September 4th, 1967, 4 experienced vertical cavers, Richard, Douglas, Ellsworth, and Lauren, were preparing to enter the Vanishing River Cave. The cave had a 150-foot vertical drop and dangerously narrow passages, so they brought their most advanced gear, including nearly 600 feet of rope. The weather in the area was notoriously unpredictable. A clear sky could turn into a violent storm within hours. Still, they didn't give it much thought. Around 3 p.m., the team began descending into the cave. First, they reached a ledge about 100 feet down. Then, at 150 feet below the surface, they discovered the main chamber. After exploring the main chamber, it was time to head back to the surface. Douglas was the first to start climbing back to the surface. He used a common caving technique called Puckett knots, a tiring and skill-demanding method, but for Douglas, it felt like just another routine climb, at least until he neared the surface, and a sudden gust of wind hit him. That's when he caught the scent of incoming rain. When he looked up and glanced outside, the sight sent a chill down his spine. Dark clouds were rolling in fast. He shouted down in panic, "The weather's changing! Hurry up!" But the rest of the team was busy gathering the ropes and packing their gear, so they didn't respond right away. Moments later, down below, Lauren, Richard, and Ellsworth began to feel a faint tremor in the cave walls. Outside, the wind grew stronger, and suddenly, rocks started falling from above, and then a scream. It was Douglas. His voice echoed through the cave, blending with the sound of tumbling rocks. Then, silence followed by a deafening crack. That was the moment everything went wrong. When Lauren looked up, all she saw was a fast-moving shadow. Douglas had lost his balance while trying to reach the surface and was thrown down between the rocks. He crashed hard onto the stone ledge 100 feet below. Ellsworth and Lauren rushed to help, but Douglas was in terrible shape and his condition was getting worse by the minute. Richard decided to climb up immediately and call for help, but the storm above had already intensified. The ropes were soaked, making the climb even more difficult. By 6:30 p.m., a deadly silence had taken over the cave. Douglas's breathing was growing weaker. Minutes passed, then hours, and at 7:25 p.m., his breathing stopped completely. It was over, but the storm wasn't, and the cave still threatened the 3 who remained. Rain had already begun pouring in, and water was rising fast. Staying there meant waiting for death. They had no choice, now they had to escape. Ellsworth gathered all his strength and climbed upward. Then Lauren tried to follow, but something even more terrifying happened. One of the ropes snapped just 30 feet from the surface. Lauren slammed into the cave wall with great force, a bone-shaking impact. But just before falling, he grabbed another rope and managed to regain her balance at the last moment. Lauren had narrowly escaped death. If he had fallen just a few more feet, he could have ended up like Douglas. With what little strength he had left, he pulled herself up and collapsed when he finally reached the surface. But in the end, Douglas had lost his life. Jackson Blue Springs Cave Tragedy. On March 5th, 2007, Harry and Gordon set out to dive into the Jackson Blue Springs Cave in Florida. However, they had no idea what awaited them. Their plan was simple: enter the cave, follow the main passage, and explore an unknown side tunnel. Before entering the cave, they checked their equipment, and after giving each other one last confirming nod, they plunged into the blue water. The descent was mesmerizing. Sunlight filtered through the cave entrance, illuminating the limestone walls. But when they reached 60 feet, the cave mouth widened, revealing a passage leading into a vast chamber filled with ancient formations. They continued, gliding between the rock formations. After about 600 feet, they saw the entrance to a narrow side tunnel. The water here was darker, and the walls were more constricting. Gordon paused for a moment. The entrance looked narrower than he had expected. He pointed his flashlight at Harry and quietly asked, "Are you sure?" Harry nodded confidently and began moving toward the narrow passage. Gordon followed him closely. They moved slowly, careful not to disturb the mud layer. The tunnel twisted on, growing narrower with each step. Then a major problem occurred. As Harry was gliding through the tunnel, his equipment brushed against a rock and his tank and harness became stuck. He tried to move, but the tight passage was pressing in on him. Without warning, a huge cloud of mud erupted, turning the once clear water into an impenetrable fog. Harry took a deep breath again, trying to calm himself. His first instinct was to go back, but as he moved, moved, the rock pressed even harder against his shoulders. So he stopped and tried to think. He didn't know what to do. The mud surrounding him was so thick he couldn't even see his own hands. Moving without seeing anything could only make his situation worse. He reached back to adjust his tank, but once again, he couldn't free it. Meanwhile, Gordon, seeing the mud cloud in front of him, had to retreat and wait for his visibility to improve. When the water cleared slightly, he saw Harry trapped in place. His body was motionless. Only his arms were desperately twitching. Gordon knew he had to call for help immediately. He left Harry behind and swam to the surface with all his strength. The journey back now felt much longer. Every second felt like an hour. Finally, when he reached the surface, he immediately called the emergency teams. Meanwhile, Harry heard Gordon's retreating movements. The water had settled again. Now, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing. He was alone here. The mud cloud had become even thicker. He knew he should wait for his friend, but the loneliness and fear overwhelmed him. Instead of waiting, he decided to try and free himself. He searched for his harness with his hands and managed to unclip the buckle. This gave him just enough room to move, and for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. "I can make it out," he thought. Determined, he decided to leave all his equipment behind. His oxygen tank slipped off, the weight vanished, and for the first time, he could move freely. But now, he had nothing. No oxygen, no safety line, and no sense of direction. Now, he only had to swim 600 feet to reach the exit. If he could find the right direction, he might survive. He searched for the water with his hands and started pushing himself forward. He thought he was on the right path, but he wasn't. He was heading deeper into the cave. On the surface, Gordon's call reached the famous cave diver Ed, who arrived at the scene in just 12 minutes. Using his underwater scooter, Ed quickly descended into the cave and reached the side tunnel within minutes. However, the water here formed a wall of mist, blocking his way. Still, Ed moved carefully, his hands searching the rocky surface for any sign of Harry. Time was working against them, and 4 minutes later, he found him. Harry was no longer trapped, but he was not alive. His tank and regulator were still working. In fact, there was still oxygen left in the tank, but panic had forced him into making the wrong choice. The one thing he needed to survive his oxygen, he had left behind. Sadly, due to his panic, Harry had lost his life. Puckett Cave Tragedy. On May 23, 1997, 3 cavers, Elizabeth, Patrick, and James, decided to explore Puckett Cave in Alabama. Originally, they had planned to enter the cave with an experienced guide, but when the guide couldn't make it, they chose to go in on their own. James and Patrick had been in the cave before and felt confident, but this adventure was about to turn into an unexpected tragedy. The entrance to the cave was terrifying because there was a 70-foot vertical drop right at the start. Still, the 3 friends tied their ropes and carefully descended into the depths of the cave. After going down another 40 feet, they reached a maze of tunnels. To avoid getting lost, they used a ball of string to mark their path. After hours of moving through chambers and tight passages, they finally decided it was time to head back. On the way back, James was walking at the rear, carefully collecting the rope. But when they reached a difficult area filled with sharp rocks, James slipped. He suddenly lost his balance and slammed into the jagged rocks, taking a heavy blow to his back. The impact left him dazed, and he got wedged into a narrow gap. The rocks had mercilessly pinned his lower body. Even the slightest movement caused him unbearable pain. And just then, Elizabeth and Patrick froze when they heard the sound of the crash. They quickly rushed to James, but when they saw him wedged in a narrow crevice, they were stunned. They feared he might have a spinal fracture, and any wrong movement could make things worse. So Patrick set out to find help, while Elizabeth stayed by James's side. Patrick climbed back to the entrance of the cave and reached the surface to call for rescue teams. At 8:45 p.m., the emergency call was made. By 11 p.m., the first rescue team had arrived at the cave. They navigated through tight passages and tunnels and reached James around 1 a.m. By then, Elizabeth was in a panic. She was on the verge of losing hope. James's condition had worsened. The cold had triggered hypothermia, which was making his injuries even more severe. The rescue team quickly began working to stabilize James. First, they administered oxygen and applied warm compresses. However, James was still stuck in the narrow crevice. The rescue team then began using a drill to slowly widen the gap. After a long effort, the gap was widened enough to free James, and he was rescued.